Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to wait a few minutes for people to continue coming in, and then we will get started. Okay, I think our numbers are beginning to stabilize. So let's get kicked off for this morning. Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to the webinar this morning. My name is Charlie Dixon, and I'm an Associate Director at the Green Finance Institute, which manages the TNFD's UK Consultation Group. I also head up market engagement in the UK for the TNFD. Today's webinar is called UK Action on TNFD. And so we're going to be hearing from 3 companies in the UK across all different sectors that have published some form of TNFD-aligned reporting. So we really help help you to break down some of the key motivations for why companies across the UK are getting started with the TNFD recommendations, what their first steps have been, and how this is helping to inform action across their organizations. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. You may wish to put your Zoom into speaker view for the best experience, given what we're going to be discussing today and the format. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the GFI website shortly afterwards. Given the number of participants that we have today, we've disabled microphones, so we encourage everybody to submit questions for our speakers through the Q&A function on the screen. We also have the chat function available, and that's primarily for us to be able to share kind of resources and interesting links with you as we go through the conversation today. So you've got access to all of the best resources. You'll also be able in the Q&A function to see questions submitted by others. And you'll be able to see as well an upvote button next to each of those questions where you can indicate if you would also like that question to be answered. So if you see a question that you like and you think, I would love to hear the answer to that, please upvote it and we'll take some of the most popular questions. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. So along with us this morning, we have Rebecca Speed, Natural Capital Implementation Manager with United Utilities. We have Richard Harris, Global Biodiversity Manager with British American Tobacco. And we have Henry Powell, Senior Sustainability Manager with Landsec. So let's get going and dig into the conversation. So the first question for most companies as they start to explore TNFD is really, why should I invest some time into this? What's the business case for me? So I wanted to start by asking across each of the different organizations we have today, what were your motivations for exploring TNFD and publishing a TNFD-aligned report? Henry, let's start with you if we can, please.
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. So, I mean, it came at quite a advantageous time for us, TNFD, because we were reviewing our nature strategy as a whole. So there was a number of drivers to review our nature strategy. Obviously, biodiversity crisis, very obviously, we wanted to clear a link between achieving net zero and improving nature, being aware that very much 2 sides of the same coin. But then also there was a lot of external drivers. We had a real uptick in interest from our institutional investors, mandatory biodiversity net gain for developments, which is very relevant to our business, and TNFD. So it was more actually a driver of us to review our strategy. what I would say is probably slightly naively, we first thought, and sorry, just as a side point for those not familiar with our business, we design, develop, and operate commercial real estate, shopping centres, large regional shopping centres, and commercial office space. However, the majority of our portfolio is actually already built and operational, but we do have some large master plans in the works. So apart from the obvious around development, it wasn't immediately obvious with our existing assets exactly where do we align. I think some of the comments were, you know, maybe we're not utilities or we're not agriculture, so how does this fit? But I think once we started the process, it became clear where we do align, and obviously now there's more industry guidance, such as the BBP's guidance for real estate. So that was sort of our first initial reaction. But then we went on the journey to write our new strategy, all in the mindset that we need to make sure that there is alignment with TNFD and we can disclose it. And I think another one of the drivers as well, especially with our senior exec board, and also our non-exec board, was that they really embraced TCFD. They really understand the importance of it, and obviously they knew the trajectory of it, where it went as mandatory. I'm sure someone's going to ask that later in the Q&A, when is TNFD becoming mandatory? But I think in order to be sort of a responsible business and understand the position that we took with TCFD, it made sense to start disclosing against that and make sure our strategy was aligned with that when we were writing it.
Great, thanks, Henry. String of different motivations there that I'm sure resonate with some of our audience members. Richard, I'd like to turn to you now and have a little chat around how does BAT's motivations compare with what we've just heard from Henry? So what really drove you to look into nature-related reporting further?
Sure. So I think for BAT, there's kind of I think we can sum up in 4 motivations. The first one was our Chief Sustainability Officer at the time asked us to try and put a strategy together to achieve like nature leadership. So as part of that, we thought we need to start aligning to one of the more reputable frameworks that is out there. So that's, I'd say, the first one, because TNFD, you know, it's got the UN, WWF, and then there's a whole host of governments that are part of the Stewardship Council. I think the second reason is investors. So when you look at like investor portals, you've got the likes of MSCI, they've already signed up to be an early adopter. You've got Sustainalytics, they've got on their website that they're tracking actively TNFD adopters. Bloomberg, it's already in their portal. I mean, you've got CDP, which we submit every year, and they have already published that they're fully aligning to TNFD, you know, and others as well. So it seemed to be a clear message out there that investors were starting to take a focus on TNFD. The third one is like there's a huge amount of linkage between TNFD and CSRD. So obviously CSRD is mandatory, but when you look at FRAG have already published guidance around how the two interface. So there's a huge amount of work that if we started with TNFD, there would be kind of cross-pollination to CSRD. And then the fourth one, and Henry alluded to it, is, you know, DEFRA are part of the Stewardship Council of TNFD. So if you're if you want to make an educated guess, will TNFD or something like TNFD be adopted in the UK as law or regulation? We're taking a guess that it might be, so why not start early? And I think we went to a round table from the TNFD, and they said, you know, they're encouraging people to just start disclosing. You don't need to do all 14 disclosures. You don't need to do your entire value chain. So that gave us then confidence to say, well, we can be an early adopter because we can start disclosing some of the information we've already gathered.
Perfect. Thanks, Richard. And I think that last point is super important. It's going to resonate with lots of people. So one of the things that we at the UK Consultation Group definitely remind people again and again is that that entry point into TNFD, the requirements of an initial disclosure are deliberately very low. So it is disclosing against at least one of the 14 recommended disclosures. And exactly like you say, Richard, it's because we don't need to tackle everything all at once. Getting started with that journey is the most important thing. So Becca, let's turn to you now as well. Could you tell us a bit about UU's motivations for exploring TNFD as well?
Yeah, so our motivations reflect what Henry and Richard have both mentioned. But so for those that don't know, United Utilities are the major water and wastewater provider for the Northwest, and we look after 56,000 hectares of land across the Northwest, and our operational impacts and dependencies go far beyond this. So it's really important that nature is considered in everything that we do. So we were early adopters of TCFD and saw the benefits that this had from the early adoption before it came compulsory. So we're seeing the same impact as becoming an early TNFD adopter. So it was really important for us to start that process early on and be able to contribute to the pilot studies and that early influence as well. So as the others has mentioned as well, our investors are increasingly becoming more interested in TNFD as well. But even last week, we've had some queries on our approach to TNFD and nature-related reporting. So we are seeing it in the investors as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Becca. So definitely some alignment across all different organizations, everyone seeing that's those same types of requests coming through from investors in particular. And so now sticking with you, Becca, would you be able to tell us, please, a little bit more about so past the motivations, what were the first steps for how UU actually got started? There's going to be lots of businesses online wondering, what should be my first action within this? How do I break this down into manageable chunks?
So when we first joined the TNFD forum, before the recommendations were actually released, we looked at our TCFD reporting and saw where are the similarities and where could we translate this into nature-related reporting. So in 2022, we released our very first TNFD response in our annual report, and this was a very, very high level of our intentions of how we were going to approach TNFD. We then looked at a desktop exercise for all of our nature-related data and how we record and report on this. We are a heavily regulated company, so there was a lot of information that we could sift through to see what was actually relevant. We've recently released our corporate natural capital account, which looks at the extent of our land across the Northwest. So where is our land and what natural capital assets do we own and manage? So this was a key component in our TNFD journey. Another key component was our senior buy-in. So our CFO was very keen really early on. He was a keen supporter and we presented our TNFD desktop findings to our political and regulatory group. And the senior buy-in was definitely something that we benefited from.
Perfect. Thanks, Becca. And I think that idea of beginning by looking across the organization and saying, what do we already have? What are we already recording? What are we already reporting is super important, because for a lot of organizations, this isn't necessarily new. May not have the same framework or the same titles of nature and biodiversity, but there's lots of links really to what the TNFD is looking for. So Henry, let's come over to you now. How does this compare with Landsec's journey? What were your first steps? And was there anything that kind of surprised you after you'd got started?
Yeah, very, very similar, really. I think that senior leadership buy is obviously key with anything like this. Our sort of primary focus of our nature strategy at the moment, the sort of first evolution of it, and also our TNFD disclosure is very much about our primary supply chain. So that is our service partners that are managing our operational sites, but then also our design and development partners that work with us on our master plans and our constructions projects. So really we identified going through that process that a lot of it was providing those partners with clear guidance as to what we expect. Some of the feedback that we got from our principal designers and architects were like, we totally support this. We just need to understand as a client what it is that you're looking to deliver in terms of nature-based solutions or more biodiverse design. So that was sort of a learning that actually it's more about good design to deliver those nature pieces. And then the other thing that we found, especially during the actual writing of our disclosure, is that there were a number of things that we may have, in terms of a reporting aspect, sort of overlooked because they were sort of deemed as business as usual. So the way that we manage our estates, how we have quite strict spill prevention and spill response procedures, training. For example, Blue Water, we have 8 lakes in Blue Water, and it is part of day-to-day management, how we do water quality testing, making sure, contractors and retail brand partners are not doing things that will affect that water course. We don't necessarily report on that, but actually in the eyes of TNFD, that's a really important aspect of how we are minimizing our impact, and then also how we're improving it, the way that we work with our landscapers and horticulturalists. So I would say to anyone that's looking to do it, there's things probably sitting there that may not be obvious at the moment, but you realize that you are probably doing a lot more than you realize. Obviously, the idea is to enhance and do more, but there is definitely a baseline of activities we found that we kind of were doing just as business as usual, that it was really sort of time to pull out and talk about and align with that TNFD disclosure.
Perfect. Thanks, Henry. So you're saying that there was lots of things that Landsec were kind of already doing that were considered the regular state of play, but you weren't necessarily talking about externally. And then when you actually went through the TNFD process, this was exactly what TNFD is kind of aimed at looking for and trying to get companies to talk about.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Perfect. Really helpful. Richard, I'd like to turn to you now then, if okay. So you mentioned before that you're already considering nature and some aspects of nature like water across BAT. So what did the first few steps look like for you? How did you build on some of your existing work?
So I'd say we started with biodiversity before the TNFD guidance had actually come out. So before the LEAP approach was, let's say, published. We started in our agricultural supply chain. So we're a tobacco company. Tobacco is grown in fields. It's an agricultural commodity. We have a very well-integrated supply chain. So we directly contract with over 90,000 farmers. We have the exact location for all of those farmers. So we actually worked with a company even as early as early 2022. We worked with the biodiversity consultancy to do a biodiversity risk assessment across that farmer base to kind of understand where are the priority farms that we should be looking at implementing action. So on the other side of our value chain, we actually followed more of a LEAP approach. So we used Encore to try and do some sectoral screening. So basically in our upstream value chain, we're a huge business. We purchase a lot of things, but we don't purchase everything in the same quantities. So that material screening is a really good place to start because it can help you focus where you actually want to then maybe go to the next step of location. So as part of that material screening, we worked out that our biggest dependencies is around land use in our upstream value chain, excluding agriculture. And that the biggest, let's say, part of that was in the pulp and paper, which is for things like packaging, cigarette papers, etc. So that material screening is a really good place to start because it can help you, again, work out where in your value chain is the best place to start. And then from there, we then did, again, biodiversity risk assessments and BECS footprint analysis to understand what's the condition of the assets in our value chain, what are the biodiversity risks for the locations in our value chain across the group. And then from that, we then start looking at how you can mitigate those. So, or how you can reduce the impact your presence may have.
Thanks, Richard. I think for so many of the companies thinking about this and working through, the idea of that materiality screening to be able to just pick out 1, 2, 3 things to focus on is super important. Reflecting on that journey that you've just said, I'd love to hear a little bit from you. Kind of, what do you think were some of the biggest challenges? What were the hardest parts of going through that process?
So I think in our Leaf, we're really fortunate. We've had a program for many decades, really, around farmer interaction. So we have really, really good data when it comes to where the locations, the size, how much water, what type of irrigation, what kind of fertilizers, pesticides are used on those farms. So we could leverage that for our Leaf biodiversity risk assessment. I think the hardest part for us was more around trying to pull together certain data that we'd never had to really capture before. So, we obviously know where all of the locations of our factories, our offices, our warehouses are, but are they coordinates? Are they addresses? Are they systemized in a list? That's a really good thing to start getting quite quickly is, if you've got a list of assets globally, so we have 181 sites around the globe that we report on in our annual report. We need the locations of those, we need the size, the extent of nature remaining at those sites is difficult. And, I think to start with, we use just pinpoint geolocation coordinates and rough approximations of the size of the site to do that biodiversity risk assessment for our own operations. We'll move forward in the future to maybe look at creating shape files, but it's data that I would say we didn't have to have before. And therefore that was maybe, one of the challenges to start with. And then on the procurement side, you're talking about a very big value chain. So again, trying to find out where the locations are, because biodiversity is location specific, risks are location specific. So, we contract with a printer. That printer will buy their board from a pulp mill. The pulp mill may buy from a timber mill. The timber mill may buy from, multiple forests. And it's kind of starting to trace that supply chain back so that you can kind of understand your risk assessments. So that's why I'd say, on the Leaf side, we're really, really well advanced in the direct operation. So the site's completely under our control. We're in a really good place. And then we're focusing on the upstream value chain and trying to expand and explore further in there. So that's why this flexibility of not having to report on everything in TNFD is really good.
It's really interesting. And so for your case, thinking about that data specifically, when you looked into it, it wasn't necessarily that the data didn't exist. So you knew where all of the sites and the factories, etc. were. It was just that it wasn't necessarily in the right format, or no one had ever tried to put it together in that way before.
Exactly. And, I'll give some examples of the headaches that our procurement team went through is, in our SAP system, so our supply chain planning type system, you may have the billing address for a pulp and paper mill that may be a completely different address to where the actual goods depart from. So it's drilling down and working out, we've got all of this information. Is that actually where the asset's located? Is that a different address? Is it a headquarters address? So I think that's where trying to create that almost that value chain map has been one of the bigger challenges, I would say.
Really helpful. I see a few questions coming through on the Q&A, which is excellent to see. Just a reminder for everybody watching, as those questions do come up in your head, please do keep posting them in the Q&A function. So now, Henry, let's go over to you and back to Landsec. I want to hear a little bit around kind of almost what comes after this process. So once you have your first steps and you've explored this a little bit, what actions or decisions across Landsec do you think that TNFD and your work on TNFD has helped to inform?
Yeah, so it's been quite a fluid process, and we're now at a stage now, as part of our strategy and very much driven by TNFD, is we've created nature action plans for all of our operational sites. So we're only in England, Scotland, and Wales, but we've detailed exactly what we want to do over the next 5 years of those operational sites in order to enhance nature. Um, Also looking at nature-based solutions, not just some of the challenges to the physical environment, such as surface water flooding, but also in that health and well-being piece, using nature as very much part of placemaking. We see that as really important. And again, that's been sort of driven by our sort of locating where those sites are in relation to significant and sensitive receptors. That's therefore then influence the design decisions that we'll be making when delivering the opportunities that we've identified in those nature action plans. The structure itself of our strategy has been formed around TNFD. We had an interesting discussion in the office where, when we had our first draft TNFD statement, a senior member of staff said to us, that's not right. That's not a TNFD statement. That's just a rehash of our strategy. And my response was, brilliant. That means we've done it correctly then. Obviously, we had other metrics that we've included within that sit slightly outside of our strategy, as I was talking about that business as usual piece. But we have been in that sort of privileged point that we sort of starting afresh, but that doesn't need, you don't have to do that to sort of embrace TNFD. And then moving forward, I see already things we're adapting things that we're doing. So we are probably sitting on a lot of data that we're not using. So one example is grey water harvesting and rainwater harvesting. We have hundreds of systems, sort of millions of litres of water that is used in that, collected in that way, but we don't report on it and we don't accurately monitor it. It's just at an individual level part of the building operation. And through going through this process, we now say, right, we need an overall measurement of where we are with all of this, and then how can we improve and maximize those opportunities. So it's already sort of shifting the way that we think about some of those building level systems, which I think is really exciting, and we'll see more of as we look to disclose more and more accurately.
Great. I really love that. If there's one message that we come away from today with, is that if there's some kind of amorphous link between your strategy and your TNFD disclosure, if the two look the same, you're doing something right. I really, really like that. Now let's move over to you, Becca. Now you're in quite an interesting position. So water utilities, so a highly regulated industry with quite significant dependencies on nature. What are some of the actions and decisions that you think TNFD has helped inform?
So I think TNFD is great for external benefits and showing our nature-related reporting externally. But I think for me, the biggest positive benefit from starting this TNFD journey has been it's helped drive internal conversations, and it adds some weight to those requests that we're making as well internally. So it does help to say this is something, it's really important, and it's something that our investors are actually keen to see. So this has actually prompted a review of our supply chain. So similar to what Richard has described earlier, we're not quite that advanced in the whole supply chain, but I did see the same issue where our tier one suppliers, their headquarters are all in the UK. So we're having to go to that next level, tier two, and see where their suppliers are, and then start looking at that location. So this is something that we're taking to our senior management to get their support to actually review our supply chain and make those conversations with our suppliers as well to get them to engage in the process. And something else is also, I mentioned earlier, we've done our corporate natural capital account. So I feel like natural capital accounting is vital for the TNFD process for us. So understanding where our natural capital assets are, what the condition is, and then starting to update that corporate account and start tracking those changes over time, so we can actually see the impact that we're making when we do environmental enhancements through our programs. I also think that TNFD is a great place to showcase where we are doing good environmentally. So it's not just a tool to show how risky our interactions are with nature. It's also, we have some really good strategies on the environment, and it might not always be presented externally. So having that TNFD and showing our environmental strategy in our annual report is a good place to show where we are having those good interactions with nature. And we do have, for example, our sites of designated areas. We have a lot of SSSI sites or areas of natural beauty, outstanding natural beauty, or national parks, and how are we protecting these areas. This is all in our strategy, and we haven't had a place to present that in our annual report before, so that it's given us a good opportunity as well, rather than just considering it as a risky showing all our negative impacts on the environment. It's also showing the opportunities as well.
Excellent, thanks. And I think especially reflecting on your comments on the procurement and the supply chains and thinking about tier ones and tier twos, I know that's a question that lots of our audience members will be thinking about, and I can see some questions have come through on that. So we'll come back to that topic later on for sure. So now finally, let's come back to you, Richard, if we can, with BAT and hear from your perspective. The same question. So what actions or decisions do you think your work on TNFD has helped to inform?
So I think from an agricultural standpoint, we're relatively progressed now along our journey. We created a biodiversity operating standard, which determines basically how farmers should behave. We've got 700 field hands globally who go out and train farmers. But we also created, again, with an expert consultancy, biodiversity management plan sort of template. And we've deployed those to priority locations determined by our initial TNFD analysis. So the idea being, if we've got 99,000 farmers, we can't prioritize every single farmer in the same year, and it's impossible to go out and do the same. We can deploy standards to those farmers, but actually then starting to work where there is a bigger priority and work more closely with those farmers. So on the agricultural side, it's already started to pay off in terms of where do we put our attention. In the operations side, as part of the TNFD, we're looking at kind of prioritizing basins. So as part of like a water strategy. So again, we've already had corporate commitments around the amount of water that we want to reduce, and we've achieved those targets 2 years ahead of schedule. But now, kind of going forward, as part of that TNFD risk analysis, we look at, well, what basins are the ones that actually need more action. And so for next year, we've got 10 priority factories where we're going to be focusing our activities more closely and monitoring them more closely to try and reduce their withdrawals in those factories, especially. So it helps, I think, TNFD with prioritization. And then, like with what Rebecca said as well, it does give us additional space to start communicating that we are taking this seriously, and we're trying to actively progress, for lack of a better word, a nature positive strategy. And then I think, there's other things that coming out. I know there's a nature positive initiative that's aligned metrics and things like that. By getting some of these data points now, it will help us with our strategy in the future, because we can kind of quantify what it would take for us to become a more positive organization.
Perfect, thank you. So that concludes the kind of the panel discussion that we have for today. Thank you so much for each of the panelists for all of their contributions. We're going to now move to the questions, and we've got lots of really exciting questions coming from the audience. So thank you for submitting those. We're going to start with quite a broad one on risk management. So where the TNFD process has ID'd risks, what are the next steps in terms of managing and reducing those risks? I think some of you have kind of already touched on this question in some of your answers, but would love to hear more. Anyone feeling particularly excited to take that?
I'll have a go.
Please go for it, Richard.
So I heard something really interesting at a conference, so I then went and fact checked. So there are 1,300 McDonald's in the UK. Now there are over 11,000 protected areas in the UK. So statistically speaking, you're more likely to be located closer to a protected area than you are to a McDonald's. So that's one of the kind of analogies that I use when I start talking to our senior managers, because if you're identifying that a site is close to a protected area or close to biodiversity, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are doing bad in that area. So I think the next steps is actually to start trying to quantify what risk you may be posing in that area. So we took some ecologists and a consultant from the biodiversity consultancy to our factory in Poland, which was identified as a high-risk site. And what we started to do there is create like a biodiversity impact assessment to understand what could our operations actually be posing as a risk to nature. And that's then what informs creating our biodiversity operating standard for manufacturing, which will be out, we're aiming to roll out this year. So it's kind of, just because you've identified a site doesn't necessarily mean that bad is happening on your site. What you then need to do is actually kind of go and understand on the ground what's happening, what could be your impacts. And that may mean that you need to engage with experts. We've used lots of different experts over the years and different consultancies. I named one, but we've worked with like EY and South Pole and some other great ones. So I'd say, that's a good place to start, is actually then start, once you've located, going kind of ground truth and actually trying to understand what are the impacts you could be having on the surroundings. And then you can then look at how to mitigate them.
Super helpful. Thanks, Richard. And you actually touched on one of the other questions that we had as well, which was around how do you engage with local experts when you're thinking about that kind of state of nature and managing those risks and improving local ecosystem states. So it's super helpful. Lots of interest in the questions on nature restoration in particular. And I know this is something Becca, you do an awful lot of. So maybe it's something that you can share some thoughts on. So the question is, would be interested to hear if anyone is exploring funding off-site nature restoration projects within their TNFD plans. And if so, how would they do this, i.e. via BNG or voluntary biodiversity credits? Is it an offset as for carbon credits, or is it something else?
I think a lot of our strategy and our water industry program, we have a lot of partnerships. I think UU is one of the biggest partnerships in the water industry, or has the most strategic partnerships in the water industry. So we already do that partnership work with sites like National Trust, RSPB, Lake District, like Friends of Windermere, that type of thing. We've got a lot of partnerships in place. So I think there's a lot of different opportunities. Sorry.
All good. All good. Henry or Richard, anything you want to add on that? Any nature restoration projects offsite come across your kind of agendas, or is that something further afield for now?
So for us, actually, no. We, as part of our development processes, projects, there are opportunities really to restore nature on site within our red line boundary. So, for example, Mayfield, we have taken a piece of industrial land with a culverted river, that's been it was a printing press for about 100 years. We've now restored that into Manchester's first city park for 100 years. I think that's more just down to our business model. And again, it's that placemaking piece. We're designing and creating places for people to live and to work and to shop. So it makes more sense to our business model to maximize opportunities on site. That's not to say, obviously, we don't know what future pipelines we would look at, and there may be a requirement for off-site offsets, but at the moment, our focus is very much on-site and those opportunities.
Excellent. I think it's going to look quite different for each different industry and each different company's context. Sorry, Richard, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think TNFD, I would say, is a really good framework for kind of disclosing what you can do to minimize like impacts within your own value chain. I think as part of a wider nature strategy, companies could decide to restore. I think we've already got like a forest positive target. So, you know, trying to plant forests for conservation purposes, and that is outside of our direct value chain. As our nature strategy evolves, I'm sure we will look to do more in the future. We've got a big project that's happening in Kenya where we're restoring sort of 2,000 hectares. And again, there's activities that we're doing. I wouldn't say it's part of our TNFD plans. I would say it's more part of a broader nature strategy around how do you move away from kind of that decline in nature to how can you actually start giving positively back.
Great. So it sounds like a lot of businesses really starting with on-site, starting with supply chain, starting with insetting really as the first port of call for that specific aspect of thinking about nature restoration. Excellent. Henry, a couple of questions coming through for you. And so lots of people interested in the Landsec journey. One around, based on what you've said, does Landsec now have a combined climate and nature strategy? And another one asking, so reflecting on what you were saying about the disclosure being used to help inform your strategy, do you have any advice on how to approach TNFD to ensure disclosures are actually actionable and relevant and don't end up in the category of reporting for the sake of reporting? I'm sure some others might have some views on that too, but love to hear from you, Henry.
Yeah, so good question in terms of the combined strategy. I mean, we have a sustainability strategy that has numerous elements to it, which includes both climate and nature. What we try to do, because we already have quite a established climate strategy, net zero fund, and obviously our science-based targets, and this new nature strategy has come a little bit later to that. What we did actively try to do is write that nature strategy directly linking to what we're trying to achieve with our climate and net zero strategy. So that's one of the key pillars, for example, is mitigating and adapt of our nature strategy is we will look to adapt and mitigate against climate change through nature-based solutions. So we've identified lots of opportunities with things like green roofs to help with heating demand and obviously providing insulation, opportunities for green roofs to help maximize the efficiency of solar panels, as a few examples. So it's not probably as a clear cut this is a combined strategy, but it just makes it very clear that it's not a standalone pillar. And that's not just with climate. You know, we have one about enhancing health, well-being, and community engagement. Again, because we're in the business of placemaking, we understand that in order for a place to be desirable for people to live, nature and green space is such an important part of that. And at the same time, we have lots of programs on social mobility and getting people furthest away from the job market into work. At the same time, we know from our horticultural partners, our landscape partners, there is a massive issue with talent coming into the industry. So how can we join them up? We can address some of the social inequalities and issues that we have, whilst providing people with the skills to actually deliver our strategy today and in the future, because we're only going to be doing these enhancements and more. So we've just tried to find numerous links to that. Sorry, the second question.
Second question was, any advice for companies hoping to keep work on TNFD actionable and relevant and avoiding reporting for reporting's sake?
Yeah, it's always the trap, isn't it? I think it's just we've always sort of, when we were doing our disclosure, anything that we were sort of disclosing that was new, we just kept asking ourselves, and what? So if we're, for example, going back to that grey water piece, if we're going to start disclosing that, and what is the narrative to say that we're going to do moving forward with that data? What actionable enhancement, or it doesn't even need to be a commitment, but what are we going to do to keep pushing that along? Our nature strategy, because it was action plan based and it's then underpinned by 3 core targets, that drives action. So we have to make sure that we're implementing and enhancing and not just reporting, because otherwise we're not going to show progress on those targets. Yeah.
Great. Richard, I saw lots of nods coming from you there when we were talking about action and avoiding reporting for reporting's sake. Anything you'd like to add?
I mean, it's interesting because, again, I would advise companies to even start the process, even if they don't plan to go out publicly with disclosure. Yeah. It will really help inform your CSRD journey if you're a company that needs to follow CSRD. Why do I say that? Is, from a impact risk opportunity perspective, when you start doing that materiality double materiality assessment as part of CSRD, you need to have understanding of your impacts and dependencies related to nature, just so that you can actually have an informed debate on the IROs. So I'd say almost you could start your TNFD journey without the intention to publicly disclose, and that's probably fine. And again, we are now working for our, let's say, the disclosures that will come out in 2025, and part of this is going to be a debate as to, is that mature enough now to be publicly disclosed? And it's not, and I think that is the thing, is until you start investigating these kind of stuff, you're not going to really understand whether it is relevant for your business. I think the question you need to ask yourself is more, let's start, but you don't have to, it's voluntary. You don't have to publicly disclose. So, there's, from that perspective, you can actually reduce any risks, and it doesn't need to be neat. It can be rough and ready, but it's a good place. It's a good framework to follow, even if you're just wanting to just understand. And then you will have your debates with lots of people around, do we want to disclose that type discussion, or if we disclose that, is the market actually ready to understand what we're disclosing? Will they see that as a negative thing where it's actually a good thing? And that is a really valid question. Is businesses are starting to educate themselves. Is the market, our financial institutions, our investors, are the media, are they in a position where they can actually read these reports and actually understand what you've put out there and not take it in the wrong way?
Really helpful. Thanks, Richard. And one thing I would maybe add from a UK Consultation Group perspective is, across the hundreds of businesses that we've spoken to, the ones that I see that I are kind of making the fastest progress and have the strongest buy-in from their senior leadership are ones that have really taken this approach of thinking first, okay, what do we think are the entry points where TNFD could be helpful for us? So not saying, great, okay, there's 14 disclosures. I think we need to do it across all these different parts of our businesses and seeing it as a checklist. They've taken a step back first and said, how is this going to be helpful? Let's do the work for that bit, and we'll grow that scope and robustness over time. So really taking that action lens. Becca, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, just wanted to add on what Richard was saying. It's definitely a good place to start is to look at the materiality and financial impact of the risks. And I think a good place to start now, which is where I wish we started 4 years ago or 2 years ago, however many years ago it was, is to look at the core metrics and additional metrics and see what is relevant to your business. And it's something that we're going through with the water industry at the moment. And Charlie, you're involved in it as well, aren't you? Looking at what is relevant for the water industry and coming together as a sector to provide that united front, basically, on what we should be disclosing in terms of metrics.
I think that's a super important point as well. And one that people forget about the TNFD framework and recommendations and guidance is that across everything, there's a comply or explain approach or basis. So if there's something that you come across that you think, oh, this looks slightly different to how we do it within my organization, it's totally fine to go with how you're already reporting or collecting that data, already thinking about that. Just explain. That's the kind of why that's the case, that you're reporting in a certain way. So there's definitely flexibility to the recommendations and guidance built in. I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Now, I promised earlier that we would come back to supply chains because I know lots of people are really interested in this. So we've got 1 question, and I think I'll come to you, Becca, first, if I may, because I know this is something that you've done work on. What questions do you ask your supply chain, and where do you start? So any thoughts would be very helpful.
So for our supply chain analysis at the moment, we haven't actually got to the point where we're talking to the suppliers. That's the next step. But we've done a desktop course assessment of what we actually use or what we procure over the last 12 months. We're looking at technical, so things like laptops and mobile phones, or construction, because we have a lot of capital projects, chemicals that are used in the water and wastewater treatment process. So something that is I've noticed in the chemical assessment is we're really good at looking at resilience of supply, but that assessment of the sustainability and what is actually the impact at the source for the environment. So this, an example is something like bauxite. It can be obtained in a sustainable way, or can also be obtained in a more controversial way where there's human conflict in some areas. So that's the kind of thing that's being highlighted in this process.
Really helpful, thank you. Richard, Henry, anything that you want to add from the supply chain perspective?
All I would add is in terms of material use, I mean, we're still on a journey, shall we say, when it comes to embodied carbon in our supply chain and understanding that. And I think it comes at a good time, this, because we can capture both sides of that coin when we're talking to suppliers. But I think, you know, when you look at the building and looking at the full supply chain in terms of materials in our development sites, it's there is a surprising lack of information readily available. So I think it's going to take some time. And again, it's something that initially made us a little bit unsure about TNFD, because we're like, well, we don't know, you know, we don't have this information, so probably shouldn't be disclosing. But I think you've already said it, Charlie, but don't let don't let that stop you from either doing an initial disclosure or looking to disclose internally, like Richard was saying. It's obviously something we need to look at, and it's a real key point of it. But to be honest, I haven't seen anyone who's really cracked that nut yet. So I think we're all on the journey together, no matter what industry we're in, to really understand that materials piece at least.
My side, I think, again, going back to just materiality screening. So understand what materials you're purchasing, try and rank them based on spend, based on gross weights, something that can help you then have your list, the amount or spend that you are doing on those different materials, feed it into kind of the Encore database, work out then your priority sectors, and just that will maybe, take your list from, I don't know, 50, 100,000 suppliers, that might take you down to 200. It might become a bit more simple. And then of those 200, you start focusing, these are our top 10 suppliers. Let's work with them and start asking information from those. As a company, we ask our suppliers to submit to CDP. So again, you can then start asking some of those top suppliers to start submitting to CDP, and then you can start seeing some of the data that they are submitting on water use, on energy, etc. So and as CDP evolves to cover more nature aspects, we can again use that as a platform to potentially get some more information about our supply chain.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to all of our panelists. It certainly resonates with lots of the conversations that I've had with people. Know that supply chain is an issue. They know it's a journey, but there's a real concern to not overburden suppliers. And so there's a focus on how do we coordinate across the industry? How do we use platforms to try and make this as smooth and easy process as possible, and learning from the experience of climate too. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. That brings us to the end of our discussion. Now, if you have found today's conversation helpful, hearing the insights into how these three panelists and organisations have navigated TNFD, I implore you to go and check out the UK Consultation Group website, because we've got loads of really useful things on there. And so essentially across the many different conversations that we've had, so hundreds of conversations with businesses all across the UK, across lots of sectors over the last year or so, businesses tend to face the same challenges. They tend to have the same questions. So we've tried to collect the information that most people are looking for into 5 really easy to understand resources, and they're all available on our website. So to run through them quickly, number 1 is, how do I talk to my board about TNFD? So how do we put this in a language that's going to resonate with them, that's going to connect with their duties, and so it's going to actually kind of gain traction. Number 2 is how a business is getting started. So what are the first few steps of exploring TNFD before I get to the point of even kind of really considering whether I'm going to publish? The third is, what does a published report look like? So which disclosures are people starting with? What combinations are they working with? Can I gain some inspiration from how others have started? And so there's information on all 3 of our panelists' organizations' reports there. The 4th is, what is the UK policy direction on TNFD? So lots of useful information there on what we've heard from the government and regulators on the kind of direction of travel. And then finally, TNFD and CSRD. So how do I think about reporting against both of these together? And there's some excellent resources on the main TNFD website that they've developed with FRAG to help organizations that are thinking about doing both of them together do that as smoothly and easily as possible. So please do go check them out. The links to all of that should be in our chat. So with that, I will thank everyone for coming today, and of course, each of our 3 panelists for excellent contributions and a really lively discussion. So we will be in touch again in around about 3 months or so time with another webinar. Please do let us know if you have thoughts on what you would like that webinar to cover. We can do a deep dive into a specific topic or do something very similar to this. And so with that, everyone, have a lovely rest of your Thursday, and thank you for joining.